Hello and welcome to our today's event, the research presentation of German teachers learning about the Shoah in Israel in ethnography and emotional heritage and contemporary encounters. I'm very delighted to moderate this research presentation and warmly welcome Professor Dr. Julia Resnik, Levenson und Dr. Friederike Lorenz. And I'm sorry I did that in German, your professional titles. So very, very warm welcome to you all from Israel and Germany. And my name is Beate Klammt. I will moderate this research presentation today. And I'm working for the Competence Center for Prevention and Empowerment. And this presentation is a cooperation between the researchers of the study and our Competence Center for Prevention and Empowerment. It's made possible by the support of the Rights, Equality and Citizenship Program of the European Union through our project Speak Up. And so I'm very happy that we meet here today and discuss this very interesting research study of 2.5 years research you present here today to us. I briefly introduce the 3 authors of the study who are with us today. It's Julia Resnik. She's from the School of Education at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a sociologist of education, and her main research areas are globalization of education policies, comparative education, multiculturalism, migrant children, and international education. So welcome, Julia. And then Levenson, who is as well at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a researcher and a PhD student. He's as well a teacher at the Armenian School at Jerusalem. And his research interests lie in sociology and anthropology of education, international education, nationalism and identity, and the education of religious minorities. And last but not least, Friederike Lorenz. She's in the unit of social work at the Free University of Berlin, and her main research areas and current research projects are about sexual and/or violence in institutions of the Protestant Church, child protection and child well-being, silence as a social practice, anti-Semitism at schools and memorials. Not to be unmentioned, there is another author of this study, which is not with us today, but should be mentioned for sure. His name is Fabian Kessel, and he is a professor at the University of Wuppertal. And so maybe I should share some words with about the counteract. You have an orientation out of which perspective I'm in here. So the Competence Center for Prevention and Empowerment is an institute for education, but as well as for research. So in the recent years, we started doing research on how is anti-Semitism dealt with in schools, especially how does anti-Semitism in schools and in everyday life affect Jewish men and women, people in Germany. And we recently published 2 studies about these topics. So one is more concerning on the perspective of teachers dealing with anti-Semitism in schools, if they can identify it, if they can address it, if they are able to act in these topics. And the other research focuses on young Jewish people who just went through German schools and experienced anti-Semitism in these. So to us, it's really interesting since we are focusing with our studies not only but as well on the views of Jewish people with anti-Semitism but as well with teachers and their views on that from a perspective of research. And on the other hand, like I mentioned, is one of the main parts of our work, the educational field, where we're working with teachers and to enable them to deal with anti-Semitism in their everyday school life. So, and due to that, I'm very interested on the insights and outcomes and results of the study of German teachers learning about the Shoah in Israel, and would really love to dive deeper into the study with you and learn more about it. Maybe, and you can add something or correct me, but the study, German teachers learning about the Shoah in Israel, focuses on the needs of teachers regarding professional trainings or trainings in further education. It is a cooperation of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Bergische Universität Wuppertal and the University of Duisburg-Essen. And the duration of the project was from July 2018 till the end of 2020. So a project duration of 2.5 years. And the research report was recently published in May 2021. And we will send you the link to the study in our Facebook chat. So everybody is warmly invited to go through that very interesting publication and to the outcomes. But now I want to get into discussion with you three, and maybe for the context of your study, it's important to know that in the context of teacher further education, each year, like hundreds of teachers from Germany participate in seminars at an Israeli Holocaust memorial. And you identified that research gap, like you wrote in your publication, as following: while an emotional inheritance and distorted narratives in the family memory stemming from the Shoah have been documented empirically in contemporary Germany, their impact has not yet been analyzed regarding teachers' goals for the mediation of the Shoah to the next generation. So maybe starting from that point, what is the study about, really? What means an ethnography, and how did you do it?
Thank you very much, Beate. I am very happy to be with you here and to discuss about our work. And yes, I wanted to add that this research was funded by GIF, the German Israel Foundation. It's important to add that. Okay, then I will try to explain a bit about our study and what is an ethnography. We know that this Holocaust memorial is Yad Vashem, which is a very well-known institution all over the world. Yad Vashem is a recognized official memorial or museum in charge of transferring, passing the memory of the Shoah to the next generations. And that as part of their mandate, Yad Vashem organized seminars in many languages for teachers and for education staff all around the world, and also for teachers coming from Germany. We wanted then to understand why German teachers come to Israel, to Yad Vashem seminars, to learn about the Holocaust, and why the ministries of education in different regions, in different landers in Germany, subsidize these 7 to 10 days trips to Israel. Then this is more or less the idea and how we start to think about this research. Okay, and then as it is written in our in the title, we see that it's in ethnography. And Beate, Beate, it's that like this. I pronounce your name. It's okay. Beate. Okay. And then what's an ethnography? We wanted to understand the whole experience of the teacher. That's why we conducted an ethnography that included several elements. The first one, participant observations, meaning we share with the teacher their activities. Especially, it was Friederike who did all the observation, because he's the only German person among us. And she observed the teachers during different sessions of the seminar, in the cafeteria during breaks, in Yad Vashem, yeah? On the bus during trips in which a teacher visited the country. That's the first element, participant observation, in order to seize all the experience in the different part of this trip to Israel. The second element was group discussion. The group discussion with the teachers in Germany before the travel to Israel, in order to understand the reasons and the expectations from the seminar, and again, group discussion when they returned to Germany. And that to see if the expectations were fulfilled and how their learning of the Shoah in Israel would influence their teaching in schools. And then it was a third element, the narrative interviews. We noticed in the seminars that, and also even in small talks during breaks, we felt the weight of the teacher's personal history of the Holocaust. We see the reactions and their interpretation of what they hear and see in the lecture, how they were influenced by their personal history, and also of their age, to what generation they belong. That's why we add narrative interviews, in order to understand how the family history of each teacher during the Holocaust, the generational differences, and if they have been living or they are been in school in the West or in East Germany, in West Germany or in East Germany, all these differences strongly influence the way teachers understand and interpret their trip to Israel and the lessons of Yad Vashem seminars more particularly. That this way I try to explain a bit. I hope that it's clear enough what was our ethnography, a whole experience of what the teacher were going through during the trip, not only in the seminar, but during their stay in Israel.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's obvious that it's quite a complex research, isn't it? So it's not only, giving in some questions and getting back some answers. And so it's very complex. And I think that you gained a lot of insights from these observation and interviews and the group discussions. As far as I know, it was not possible to do all the group discussion after the trips due to Corona, but nevertheless, you succeeded to get in touch with the people and get their insights after the trips, which is, I think, is really important to contrast, like the before expectations and the afterwards outcomes of those. So thank you very much for the insight in that, what means an ethnography. So it's obvious that you had a lot of material to analyze, I think. Thank you very much. I don't know if you, Lance, or Rico want to add something to that question, maybe a point. You don't have to. Okay.
I think Julia explained it perfectly.
I think it's yeah, it reminded me a bit of the emotional heritage. So that is a point that we are working a lot with, and we published on that topic as well. So this is a very interesting point to me, to go deeper into that. Maybe another question, when I went through your study, in the summary of the study, you're writing, there's a desire, or I quote you, this desire for purity and an undamaged identity is likewise reflected in the teacher's search for emotional catharsis as they embark on the Yad Vashem pilgrimage. So, or later on in the conclusions, through fulfillment of a secular pilgrimage to Yad Vashem, German teachers search for emotional catharsis and personal connections to the Shoah, as well to the Middle East conflict, which can subsequently be passed on to pupils and colleagues. So that term of the secular pilgrimage I think is a very interesting one, and maybe is taking up the point of what were statements or attitudes, expectations of the teachers before they went to Yad Vashem and to their journeys there, and afterwards. So maybe you could give some insight of that term, secular pilgrimage, because I think that it's really a core point of your outcomes, as far as I understood.
Sure. And I prepared a little visual aid to help with answering this question. Hopefully you can see. Yes?
Perfect.
So the map that's on the left shows all of the different Shoah memorial sites that are in Germany where the atrocities actually happened. And so our question was, well, given so many of these primary, or what Cohen called in situ memorial sites in Germany, where the atrocities of the Shoah actually took place, well, what draws German teachers and the German education ministries to fund trips to Israel, to Yad Vashem, which is considered an in populo memorial site, located in the homeland of the affected people, on what has been termed in the past a dark pilgrimage. And Jerusalem has always been a center of attraction for pilgrims over centuries. It's been described as special, magical, sacred, overwhelming, intense, amazing, awesome, holy, emotionally gripping. And these are words that you think you would associate with pilgrims coming for a religious experience, but these are actually the words that the teachers use to describe their visit to Yad Vashem when reflecting on it. So this was the first piece that made us start to think about the pilgrimage concept. We trying to understand this phenomenon of using this religious vocabulary to describe the Yad Vashem experience, we turn to the anthropologist Victor Turner's theory of pilgrimage, which describes pilgrimage as an individual's ritual and symbol-laden journey from home to a distant center out there in search of authentic experiences. And so in this case, the German teachers are leaving the mundane, everyday experiences in their schools in Germany in search of authentic experiences in Jerusalem. And contemporary scholars have extended this religious classical model of pilgrimage to secular pilgrimages. There have been scholars who have written about pilgrimages to Elvis's home in Graceland in the United States, pilgrimages to Star Trek conventions. Within Israel, there's been studies on hiking pilgrimages within the state of Israel. Or Jackie Feldman wrote about the study of Israeli youth pilgrimages to Poland, to concentration camps. So we kind of took this idea and we applied it to the research study that we conducted. Just a few quotes here from Turner so you can see how we apply it. Turner wrote that a pilgrimage center represents a threshold a place and moment in and out of time. As in the liminality of initiation rites, such an active pilgrim is confronted by sequences of sacred objects and participates in symbolic activities, which he believes are efficacious in changing his inner and sometimes hopefully outer condition from sin to grace or sickness to health. He hopes for miracles and transformations, either of soul or body. Another quote here from Turner is that one piles up a store of nagging guilts, not all of which can be relieved in the parish confessional, especially when the priest himself may be party to some of the conflicts. When such a load can no longer be borne, it is time to take to the road as a pilgrim. So in our ethnography, we see how German teachers come to Yad Vashem in search of relief from these nagging guilts that they have from the emotional heritage that they've inherited, the problems of anti-Semitism and the rise of the new right in German schools. So that they come searching for solutions and for emotional catharsis. So teacher expectations, they're looking for a cure-all curriculum for anti-Semitism in German schools. They're looking to feel something emotionally that they can pass on to their students. And while in Israel, they engage in transformative emotional experiences through contact with Jews and Jewish space. And a particular example of that, which hopefully I'll read a section from later, is through contact with Holocaust survivors and the encounter with Holocaust survivors. And when they return home from this pilgrimage, the German teachers, they express that they've been transformed somehow, but yet there's sort of a struggle to reconcile that transformation then with the everyday life in German schools and all of the problems conveying the Shoah that are there. So that's what we mean by this term secular pilgrimage and how we applied it in the ethnography.
That's super interesting. So there's one thing I forgot to mention. So if you're watching us right now live on Facebook, we warmly invite you to post your questions and comments in the chat, and so that we can discuss that. So if you have something, please feel free to comment and pose your question. And Lorenz, what you said it's really, I was smiling when I heard that. I don't know why I had that reaction of that pilgrimage, the figure of pilgrimage. I found it very interesting when you showed the map of Germany and all the memorial sites in Germany and how many of them are there. And then the map of Israel with Yad Vashem as the only memorial marked there. And I thought about what you said, they're searching for the authentic experience. And I asked myself, what kind of authentic experience is it what they look for, actually? Because if you just want to reflect or educate yourself on the Shoah, there are so many Holocaust memorial sites in Germany you could visit, probably one only an hour far away from you. So, but it's really interesting that they travel to Israel, to Yad Vashem. And as far as I understood you, it's not only being in Yad Vashem, but being in Israel and talking to, sorry to say, it's a real Jewish people, and having this experience. So this striving for the authentic experience is, I think, something very interesting. What are the needs behind that, and what are they actually looking for? So thank you for that insight on that term of your secular, the term you develop of secular pilgrimage. I think it's a very, very interesting point that we have here. And maybe this leads to my next question, that you contextualize the teacher's needs and expectations against the background of the concept of emotional heritage. So maybe this is, to my understanding at least, this is somehow connected, I think. Maybe you could explain what that emotional heritage means or what insights you had out of your study.
Yes, we would try to explain a bit how we conceptualized these desires the teacher mentions and their wishes and ideas, what motivates them to go to Israel with this concept of emotional heritage. And to contextualize it, it's maybe relevant to understand that most of these 80 teachers, not all of them, few also have a migration history in the family, a younger migration history, but most of them were socialized in quite similar memory milieus in the post-Shoah society or the post-nationalistic society, how Astrid Messerschmidt calls it. And this society, as we know, or as it is sometimes also described, is characterized by a dissonance between the official memorial German culture, how to memorize the Shoah in the last decades, which is kind of nation shaping and a key point of the national identity, to have this kind of memorial culture, official memorial days, and also the memorial places you just mentioned. And in contrast to that, the family memory, or also the practicing, the doing memory in schools, in peer groups, in the society, which is also characterized by kind of silence practices or tabooizing certain topics, especially the personal or the family involvement in National Socialism. And to understand this dissonance, which is leading to some kind of incomfortism or some struggle with what does the Shoah mean to myself, what does it mean for the present, what the teachers explain very good, can maybe be understood by this concept of emotional heritage, which goes back to Sigmund Freud and was then modified for the Shoah context by Baron, Brenda Harry, Angela Mouret, also Marina Chernivsky and others. And this concept of emotional heritage with regard to the Shoah means that the generations after, who grew up in a post-genocide society, were confronted on the one hand with mostly dominant silence with regard to the involvement of their parents, grandparents, other family members, teachers, and so on and so on. And on the other hand, got kind of an immaterial heritage by emotions that were present in their daily life, but often not explained to them, by hints, by little puzzle pieces they found about the past and had to explain to themselves. And this emotional heritage leads to a certain emotional connection to the Shoah, which is on the one hand strong and on the other hand not specified, not clarified, and not reflected on in many families and also other contexts. And at this, what the teachers describe in the narrative interviews and what we know from previous studies, for example, from Gabriele Rosenthal, or the Memo study from Andreas Zick and others, or the famous book My Grandfather Was Not a Nazi from Harald Welzer, Caroline Moller, and Schugnal, is that what is dominating in the family discourse about the Shoah in Germany is a focus on the own suffering of family members, like stories about family members suffering, especially at the end of the war or by escaping from Silesia and other places, stories of helpers and resistance by imagining the own family members not as involved or as maybe accepting being involved in crimes or accepting crimes, but rather in being helpers or resisting against the Nazis, or even helping Jewish people in other persecuted groups. And also this family memory is characterized by a strong distance to the victims of the Shoah and other victims of National Socialism. And if we look now to our material, the teachers in the group discussions before they come to Israel, we ask them openly, what do you expect when you think about this day? What motivates you? What are your expectations, your feelings about it? And by themselves, in most of the group discussions, they ended up in this negotiating and discussing their personal connection to the Shoah. And on the one hand, most of them made very clear, I quote now one teacher, there is no personal reference from the family history. Most of the teachers stated that. And on the other hand, if they started to discuss among each other, they said things like that. I will quote one teacher, we called her Daniela. She's an economy teacher from West Germany in her 50s. I quote, as a German, you always have such a special view on it. so that you take it with you. Also how the grandparents became perpetrators there. In our family, we also didn't talk much about it, as my grandfather died relatively early, so there was not so much opportunity to clarify that. But anyway, I find one grew up with such a feeling. So she describes on the one hand the strong silence in her family, and that there was not so much opportunity to talk about something from the child perspective. And on the other hand, she grew up with such a feeling that there was something, some connection to the perpetrator society that was not clarified for her. And that I come to a second and last quote about this point that clarifies the strong emotional expectations the teachers have. And they look forward to some form of cleaning or catharsis in Israel at a place far away, as Lorenz explained before, from the perpetrator space. And I quote one teacher, Klammt, in his 30s. He says in the group discussion, I kind of expect something mega emotional, actually, what I would call catharsis in the theater. In concentration camps, I can look around, but then I consider that the perpetrators somehow did this. But this memorial, he means Yad Vashem, is somewhere in the heart of the people who somehow were mainly affected. So in these quotes, you can see that the teachers, many of the teachers desire some closeness, some physical being there, and some form of catharsis, which they describe with many other metaphors. And we tried to frame that with the concept of emotional heritage.
Thank you very much. I think it's really interesting what you described, that at the same time people are very attached from the topic, so there is a high relevance, a high emotional bonding to that topic in them, but they don't have words for that. They're not clear with that. They don't know about their family stories. I could imagine that there's as well a very high taboo on what was the story of my German non-Jewish perpetrator family in the NS, and that maybe comes together when people come to Yad Vashem and are looking really for that catharsis. It's very interesting. It's a very highly emotional and very high expectations what they have, what should happen to them only because of a study trip. So really interesting with that. Well, maybe so now I interpreted your research, and but I did not do it, so I don't know if these are research outcomes or results you found. So maybe we could open up just that you give us some insights about the results you analyzed and found out. That would be really interesting. Maybe we could hear a little from your study as well. So Lorenz, if you want to go.
Yes, sure. So we thought that we would share with you one chapter that from the ethnography about the encounters with the survivors.
Yeah.
Today, one of the most pressing and critically debated pedagogical questions concerning the teaching of the Shoah is how to prepare teachers when witnesses nearing the end of their lifespans are no longer present. Numi posed this question to teachers in the workshop she was leading before the much anticipated survivor encounter. Quote, a main question at Yad Vashem is, what will it look like if you can no longer interview contemporary witnesses? End quote. 3 of the 4 observed groups engaged in a survivor encounter, each consisting of 3 parts: a preparatory workshop, the actual meeting, and a reflection with teachers and seminar leader. During the preparatory workshops, German teachers often expressed high expectations for the encounter related to this generational question. According to Katerina, the fact that, quote, for students, it, talking about the Nazi era, is so far away, not tangible, points to the importance of survivor meetings for reaching students. In addition to their students, some teachers, such as Klemens, also feel a lack of connection to the generation of National Socialism. Quote, I have no personal connection, Contact with survivors is the only way without personal connections, end quote. Bearing the responsibility for transmitting authentic memories to their students, the teachers themselves seek an emotional connection with the survivor. Quote, biographies make it more emotional, Moritz claimed, and Laura confirmed that's also the goal in the school, that the students connect. Playing the role of students in the seminar, the German teachers hope for an emotional experience that they can subsequently transfer to their pupils. Although teachers embark on the Yad Vashem pilgrimage with expectations of an emotional connection, Leah, who is one of the Yad Vashem staff at the German desk, emphasized during a preparatory workshop that this is not the purpose of working with survivors from the perspective of the German desk. Quote, it is about stimulating a process of self-reflection and not going into a consumption attitude, an expectation. We are the listeners. There is a mutual relationship between us and the survivors, end quote. Yet despite Leah's words of caution, the teacher's quest for connection ultimately commodifies the survivor encounter. Teachers often pose questions to survivors regarding their present feelings toward the German people, culture, and language, as if searching for threads to establish the connection. For example, Bert asked Ofra, a survivor, your children and grandchildren, how would you describe their relationship to Germany? Is that something special because of the family history? And Merle inquired, are there customs, cultural aspects, foods that your parents took away from Germany? Ofra's response that sometimes I do things my grandmother asked, sometimes I make apricot dumplings, elicited laughter and expressions of joy from the teachers. Juxtaposed with the teacher's inherited guilt, Ofra's inherited recipe for a classic German dish provides the participants with the desired emotional connection as they see reflections of themselves within the survivor and her family. Mattis even compared the survivor meeting to, quote, talking with grandma, end quote. Moreover, the teacher's laughter indicates a sense of relief, as Ofra's preparation of apricot dumplings seemingly signifies a lack of resentment towards German culture, and by extension, the German people. While Leah warned her group that, quote, sometimes survivors do not meet expectations, end quote, Lydia reflected afterwards that she nevertheless, quote, stumbled into the trap of expectation. This trap of expectation is rooted in current German pedagogical discourse, which calls for lessons on the Shoah to evoke specific emotions. Given that emotions are closely connected with teacher family biographies, this expectation is magnified during meetings with the survivor, who may resemble one's grandma with regard to her biological age. As a result, German teachers expressed disillusionment when their emotional expectations for the survivor meeting were not fulfilled. Following what teachers perceived as an unemotional encounter with Peter, a survivor, who delivered a traditional lecture with PowerPoint slides, multiple teachers conveyed their disappointment during the reflection session. Rita said, I had to let go of expectations. I thought I was getting a Magdalene antidote, I presumed. Jutta said he did not represent the victim. Christian said, I have seen women twice as contemporary witnesses with a much more emotional note. And Johanna said, I have to free myself from expectations. They were met to 0.0%. Anticipating a tearful encounter, the teacher's hope for an emotional connection is unfulfilled by Peter's matter-of-fact style of presentation. From the participant's perspective, this lack of emotion diminished the authenticity of the encounter, which is long awaited as a highlight of the Yad Vashem pilgrimage. Beyond the search for an emotional connection, Leah stated in a narrative interview that she, quote, always feels the German teachers are longing for forgiveness when they meet survivors, end quote. When survivors, such as Peter, are not perceived to represent the victim, it is no longer possible for the German participants to imagine the encounter as capable of bestowing forgiveness. But in those cases in which the survivor fits the participant's conception of the victim, such as Josepha, the encounter has the potential to provide the coveted catharsis. At the end of Josepha's talk, she offered hugs to the teachers, who eagerly accepted the invitation to experience a tangible connection. As the diminutive figure of Josepha wrapped her arms around the smiling German teachers who towered above her, she planted kisses onto each of their cheeks. Overwhelmed with emotion, some teachers whispered words of gratitude. For example, "Thank you, that was so nice, that was so beautiful," while others wiped tears from their eyes as they made physical contact with an authentic survivor, the holy grail of their secular pilgrimage. The group posed for a collective photograph with Josepha to serve as proof of this magical moment in which the survivor and the representatives of the perpetrator collective finally embraced. Quote, "She forgave us," proclaimed Friederike during the reflection session. The German teachers evaluate the success of a survivor encounter based on feelings of authenticity and forgiveness, as victims appear to expunge the guilty charge imparted upon members of the perpetrator collective. However, this fixation on forgiveness belies those explicit educational goals for survivor encounters with students in Germany, which the teachers had just discussed in the preparatory workshop moments before meeting Josepha. Furthermore, it contradicts the objectives of these encounters in the eyes of Yad Vashem's German desk and those of the invited survivors. For example, Josepha understands the telling of her story as a duty, not in the name of reconciliation, but for the sake of remembrance and for conveying a humanistic message to younger generations. Similarly, Ofra answered, quote, "I think it's important for groups to know," end quote, when she asked why she chooses to speak at Yad Vashem, echoing Leah's reference to participants as listeners during the preparatory workshop. When the teachers converged on Josepha following her lecture, Leah expressed her dismay by refusing to be included in the photograph, which she later characterized as a, quote, "trophy" when interviewed. But for the German teachers, their pilgrimage to Yad Vashem is not about listening. It is about feeling. The trophy photograph with the survivor memorializes this emotion-filled moment of perpetrator-victim connection as a palpable piece of evidence which may help the teachers to share this feeling with students and colleagues upon their return to Germany.
Thank you very much, Lance. That was really astonishing to hear that. And I thought of, you said that the teachers are striving for emotional experiences, and then when they come to Yad Vashem, it's not about what they hear or if they're listening, but they want to feel. But I think it's even more specific. They have a very good idea in themselves of what they want to feel. So it's not only about an emotional experience, but it's about the imagination they have in themselves and bring there to Yad Vashem. Because I mean, an emotional experience could be that I'm irritated by Peter not being the survivor I wanted him to be. So, but nevertheless, I'm emotional about that. So I'm irritated. That is an emotional swell. But there, it seems like that, maybe not consciously, but that they have a very clear idea of which emotion has to happen there, and they're looking for it. This is what I heard out of this. So, and I asked myself as well, what you think maybe about this point of passing on the emotional experience the teachers had in Yad Vashem, passing on to their students back in Germany, and what you think about this concept of emotions, or I think we should discuss as well, what do we mean by emotions in the context of educating about the Shoah as well. So I think it's impossible to educate on Shoah without emotions, but what kind of emotions are the ones that shall be collected in Yad Vashem and then carried back to Germany to pass them on to the students? So I would really be very interested in your perspectives on this.
Yeah, maybe I start and you add. I think this is very interesting, the emotional expectations and in general connected to the expectations and ideas what this seminar is about, because when we look to the concept of the German desk, it has, maybe you can describe it as a rather analytical focus and rather as the idea of cognitive empathy, to learn to switch perspectives without feeling the other perspective. When we look at the expectations of the German ministries, you can explicitly find the idea the teachers should go to Israel, not only Yad Vashem, also Israel in general, to return better equipped in their struggle against anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism at schools in Germany. And also in some interviews with ministry representatives, we find the idea to increase the motivation of teachers by being there, learning, meeting Jewish people, and so on. So this is indirectly, I think, also part of emotional expectation, because all this is based on the idea of some intensive experience. And I would say maybe it's not so clear what emotion exactly is targeted here. It's more, it has to be somehow intense already in the call from the ministries. And the teachers, exactly what you just mentioned, it's not only their own emotions, they look for a personal cleaning, clarifying, but they are also there as teachers and also addressed as teachers in the research. So they also mention, and afterwards I can touch my students deeper and I can touch them, then the class works better and the class is on fire. Then one teacher says, when I'm more motivated. So also here it's about the intensity of emotion, but I feel often it remains kind of unclear what emotion they are exactly looking for. And I guess in the situation with the survivors Lenz just read out, it's also about feeling relieved, maybe an emotion of relievedness, to be accepted, to feel some connection, even if it's just about old-fashioned German food, this situation. And it's much about a personal relieving. Maybe this is one emotion we can find, but I would mostly say it's about the intensity in contrast maybe to this dissonance between the silence and taboo and unspoken in the family and this very moral and normative German memorial culture. Maybe this describes, this is maybe a reason for this desire for intensity. Maybe you have more to add here.
I would just add that what Rike was saying, in the German educational discourse, there's expectations that the Shoah education is going to produce specific emotions, and the teachers come from the background where they say, well, I don't have any family connection, I don't have any emotional connection. And so in order to elicit the expected emotions, they're looking to find that connection, whether it's through meeting the Holocaust survivor or meeting a Jewish person in the street or hearing about tools that can help them to combat anti-Semitism. But they're looking for an emotional connection to fill the expectation that Shoah education is emotional.
Julia, do you want to add something? Only if you want to. So if everything is said, everything is said. Okay, good. I was wondering if you, I don't know if you can sum it up now here in this format, but what were just like the crucial results of your study that if you can sum them up, and if it's possible. So, I mean, you identified, your journey started with that research gap you identified, and you started to work on it, I'm sure. And it's so often like this that you see one gap and you start to fill it and to work on it, and then you see how big the gap really is, or you see so many more gaps. Maybe this could be an effect as well. Yeah, I would be really interested into that.
Sorry, I didn't understand very well what was your question.
My question was if it's possible to just really, in this format like here, so we have that online discussion, if it's possible to sum up really the crucial results of your study. And then I referred back to the quotation I started, I think, the first question with that you went on the way with that study because you identified that research gap. And I was wondering if you were able to fill that research gap by your results, or you say, yeah, we have important results, but we see so many more research gaps now once we started our journey.
I think our surprise, yes, was I started with that a bit about how we learn, how we can learn about the Shoah. That you cannot separate, you know, your own experience, your history, your family history, your present, your past from the way you learn. That's very general, but it was so clear in this study, and that's why we focus on generational differences. We focus on people that they were brought up in the West or in East Germany, because their schooling was different and the learning about the Shoah was completely different. Then when we teach the Shoah also, I think that's one of the lessons, the most important lesson of our study, is that if we want to transfer, to pass on the question of the Shoah and also to struggle anti-Semitism, we have to be aware to touch the student, and how we can touch them, and we have to connect them with their own story, with their own, if for instance, different ethnic group, religious group, if the children belongs to different groups, the teacher has to take that into consideration. If you want to touch them, if you want to teach them about rights, human rights, about the risk of not respecting human rights, all of that. You cannot, you know, it's not like a lecture, an open lecture that you teach them, but you have to touch them through connecting them to their own history. And that, I think, is a lesson, a very important. It was, I think we tried to explain that during this conversation, this discussion, but I think it's the most important result of our research. How to pass on, it is through paying attention to the history, the family history, the group of belonging of the student in front of you. You can add, please, if you want to add something else.
Yeah. Yeah, I would connect to what Julia said, and exactly, I think one main finding of the research, which was maybe obviously before, but it's becoming very clear with our material, is that the whole question on how to teach the Shoah, but also how to work against current forms of discrimination, very much starts with the teachers themselves. And maybe I would highlight just two aspects, and we can add more because there are a lot of findings, so it's sometimes hard to choose what to highlight. The teachers in all these interviews and group discussions and seminar discussions which we observed mention a lot of needs they have with regard to their teacher work in Germany at schools. And maybe one point with regard to teaching the Shoah is that many teachers describe themselves as quite unprepared by their university training. This was also shown in previous studies, but in this study it becomes very clear with a little difference between East and West and generational differences. But many teachers describe that they didn't study the Shoah at all in their university study because they were not so interested at that time, or in a very briefly form. Some also say they felt well prepared, but most say not. It was not a big issue in their study. And then some describe later in their teachers' practice at school, they feel kind of either overwhelmed or that it is really hard to find a well-structured lesson because of this lack of practical material. And this is one big hope, what they also bring to the seminar, to find a well-prepared material that they can use at school to teach. So this question, how are teachers prepared to teach the Shoah, and this need for material is maybe one finding. And similar, many teachers mention their overwhelmment and problem to work against anti-Semitism, but also racism at their schools, and hope to find answers here in a seminar about the Shoah. And maybe these are two topics that lead to other questions. Which support do teachers get in their daily life? What are the concepts they are working with, or the further education in Germany? And then in a broader view, what becomes very clear in the narrative interviews, in the group discussions, is this stability of certain practices of what we call maybe skewed or distorted family narratives, that even the younger generation, teachers in their 20s, 30s, 40s, whose parents were definitely either children or maybe teenagers in National Socialism, still continue with this practice of defending their family, and this story of helping grandparents, and this victim story, the self-victimization. I think this is a very interesting finding, that this is not becoming less between the generations. It's more kind of a stability, and at the same time this idea, I have no personal connection. And last but not least, we found a stark contrast between the very few teachers with a migration history in their family and the teachers who have a family connection to the perpetrator society, as the teachers with a migration history in their family often have kind of another narrative from their childhood, from their family, which we could carefully describe as maybe a bit more open or a bit more connected when they talk about childhood memories, to family talks, or their connection to Jews. It's another form of talking that we find in these interviews, and maybe this is something that would be really interesting to do deeper research on that aspect, because it's also interesting with regard to heterogeneous teacher teams and heterogeneous classrooms, what Julia also mentioned.
Thank you very much. I think it was not a nice question for me to force you to sum it up that briefly, but thank you very much. I think there are some very important points which I take with myself, being more on the side of being an educator myself. So I just try to connect right now in my thoughts, what does this actually mean for the trainings we offer? So what are, how could we just get the insights of your study, but as well the insights of the study we did in our research department? How can we transfer them into the education? So I think this is not your field of work. So you're the researchers, but maybe you have, as a very short last question, if you don't have any recommendations on that, but maybe you have something in mind, what you think, okay, what does your insights and results do your insights and results lead you to maybe some recommendations regarding teaching or learning about the Shoah and the Holocaust?
I think I already tried to do that when I explain about how teachers have to understand what the student he has in front of him. That's, I think it's one of the main points.
Yeah.
Take into consideration the history, the past, his belonging, and I think because we can speak about particularistic and universalistic lessons of the Shoah, but I think we know that.
Yeah.
It's not so interesting. We can discuss what's the meaning of the universal lessons of the Shoah, but also the particularistic lessons. But I think the main point from our research, it's we are to be attuned with your students, your pupils.
Absolutely. No, Julia, you were very clear with your point. So maybe I'm really speaking from this perspective of an educator. And so I'm like, please hands on, give me something very concrete, you know. So maybe I misleaded myself here, but no, I got that point. You were very clear about that. But Friederike, you wanted to say something as well, I think.
Maybe, yeah, there are many interesting aspects we could discuss now, but maybe one point also our colleague Fabian Kessel mentioned that, who's not here today, that what is so strong in the material is this desire for an emotional experience. And he said something in the direction, how can experiences become, how can events become educative experiences, like in this direction? And what this journey to the seminar to Israel, also the trips to the north or through Jerusalem, or also some groups go to the West Bank. The teachers get a lot of impressions, and some of them return and have the idea, now I understand how it really is. And here we thought this question could be interesting. How could this kind of event, to see something from a tourist perspective or in a short visit, how can that create and become an educative process and reflection process and maybe to pass less on the emotion to the student, because it's always your own emotion that you pass on, maybe to pass more on these questions and reflection process, and to put this in the focus of the teaching, your own irritation and questions you had. And this is maybe another aspect, because what we found really astounding in this research is how much the focus, especially from the ministries also and the teachers, is on this experiencing something super special, intensive, and this idea that this could be a life-changing experience after, and probably the experience comes maybe afterwards, the work comes afterwards, in the reflection and in the sense making. And some of these teacher groups do that. They meet after, they hold contact to each other, they try to invite guest speakers afterwards. So this could be also maybe one point educators can take from it. Where do I get inspiration that leads me to an own process, and how can I transfer that to reflective moments with my groups, students, whoever I'm working with?
If I can add something to the answer, more concrete. I was thinking a bit about more concrete example. For instance, in Yad Vashem, their mandate is to the memory of the Shoah, okay? And they don't like very much then when teachers, the German teachers, they come and compare what is going on in Palestine with Palestinian. And that's, I think, that I tried to say that, but now I use it as an example, that we cannot neglect the feeling of the students, that they tell us, but what now Jewish people are doing in Israel, it's like, I think that's what I said, when we have to look into the eyes of the student and tackle this question, and not try to eliminate, I know that's completely different, then it's part of the problem of minorities, of rights, and then we cannot ignore them because they are feeling that. And that's why, and that here is a connection with what Friederike says, that when teachers, they come to Israel, and then they understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict better. We cannot ignore. If we speak about the Holocaust, we cannot speak about the Holocaust only in the past. We have to speak about what happened in the Jewish nation, in the Jewish state today with the other minorities. Then also, that's a way to confront I think, it's like a lesson from this study, to confront the anti-Semitism in Germany. To be honest vis-a-vis the students, not to erase the problem, because we heard also many teachers say, no, it's not like this, it's not really, it's a childish thing, that there are some anti-Semitic jokes. No, it's not our idea. It's not the point. You have to take it and to confront this question very seriously, like childish questions. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's just like facing the complexity and all the relations, the personal heritage of the teachers, but as well the students, the context of the situation. So, but I mean, it does not make it easier for educators who wish to give me that material. I print it and I do my lesson, but I think as well that this is the way through it. So the only way that makes sense to really embrace this complexity. So, okay. Well, I just was looking at the time. So now it's 6:10, at least in Berlin, it's 6:10. Somewhere else, it's somewhere another time. But I did not get any questions from the audience. So, and I think to me that was a beautiful round conclusion, at least. But of course, I would give you the opportunity if you want to have some final words, something I did not ask and you did not say yet, but that is important to share here. So feel free for that. No.
I want to thank the German teachers that participated in our research. They opened themselves to us, to Rike, but to us as well. And really, it is important to try to understand really deep, because teaching and learning, it's a very, very complex thing.
And we should also add our thanks to Yad Vashem and the staff at the German desk for also allowing us in to do the research and for cooperating and for being interviewed and as well.
And also to Beate and your institution to invite us to share our research.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure for me. We will post the link to your study so that everybody who's really interested into it, and I really recommend it, can read this. And thank you so much for taking your time and discussing with us. And yeah, then I wish you all a beautiful evening and thank you so much once again.